It began quietly, behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, a night no one was supposed to remember. But whispers echoed through the corridors, unsettling the still air. Two figures met under the cover of secrecy, forging an agreement that would shatter the royal order. And when Prince William discovered the truth, his fury was colder than the London fog. What pact could have pushed the future king to strip his uncle of everything? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The palace, usually cloaked in ceremonial routine, was different that night. Footsteps were softer, doors opened with unusual caution, and hushed voices carried a strange weight. Deep inside those historic walls, Camilla's influence had started to seep through like smoke beneath a locked door. She had mastered the art of quiet power, positioning herself where eyes didn't always look in whispered conversations, informal dinners, and calculated gestures that often went unnoticed until it was too late. This was one of those nights. Andrew, long stripped of the commanding presence he once held, wandered the palace with a heart full of resentment. Years of public disgrace and internal sidelining had left him desperate for relevance. The halls he used to glide through as a prince of stature now seemed colder, narrower, as if the walls themselves were reminding him of how far he had fallen. He wanted back in, not through the press or the public, but through the very institution that had exiled him in silence. And Camilla, ever watchful, saw a chance to use that desperation. In a secluded wing, where few dared to interrupt, their conversation unfolded like a slow, deliberate game of chess. She spoke of shared goals, mutual understanding, and opportunities that could restore balance, at least her version of it. For Andrew, it sounded like redemption. For Camilla, it was a strategy. The pact wasn't written, but it didn't need to be. It was sealed in whispers, in exchanged promises, in the unspoken understanding that together they could counter the growing force that was Prince William. But nothing in the palace stays buried forever. William's aides, loyal and sharp, had caught fragments of their late-night dealings. A misplaced phrase here, an overheard mention there, is enough to spark suspicion. It wasn't a complete picture, but it was enough to raise alarms. Rumors began to circulate among the inner circle, painting a vague but troubling picture. Andrew and Camilla were aligning themselves in ways that threatened the established order, and this was no minor breach. This was a direct challenge to William's future authority, a whisper that could snowball into a storm, because what William would soon uncover would not only humiliate Andrew but threaten the very hierarchy of the monarchy itself. The pact may have been born in silence, but its consequences would echo like thunder. But to understand why this pact struck such a nerve, we must go back to the simmering tensions that had been quietly building between William and Andrew long before that fateful night. The public saw only polite smiles and formal bows, but behind closed doors, William and Andrew's relationship had long turned into a silent battlefield. Two men, one family, but utterly different visions for the monarchy. William's modernizing stance clashed brutally with Andrew's desperate grip on old privileges, and as the Queen's era faded, their unspoken rivalry was ready to erupt into open confrontation. Their tension was never about a single moment. It was the product of years of shifting power and changing expectations. William's star was rising, not only because he was the heir, but because he represented the monarchy's future. He understood that survival in the modern world required adaptation, transparency, streamlined roles, and a calculated distance from the scandals that had once defined the royal narrative. Andrew, however, was a relic of another age. He had thrived in the era when titles alone commanded respect, when protocol outweighed public perception, and when the monarchy felt untouchable. But times had changed, and he hadn't. While William was being briefed daily on matters of state, reshaping royal operations, and preparing to lead a new generation, Andrew was quietly being moved to the margins. Invitations to key events became fewer. His role at official gatherings grew symbolic rather than functional. Once, he had been at the heart of royal operations. Now, he was an accessory present but no longer influential, and every time William took center stage, Andrew felt his own shadow shrinking. Behind closed doors, resentment brewed. Andrew often reminisced about the old palace ways, a time when hierarchy was unquestioned and his position was secure. He saw William's vision not as evolution but as erosion, a dismantling of the traditions that had once given him significance. Every modern policy, every streamlined decision, every attempt to redefine the royal brand felt like a personal attack on everything he had once stood for. This tension spilled subtly into private moments. At state banquets, William's position was always elevated, while Andrew's seat drifted further down the table. At ceremonial events, photographers and advisors focused on William, leaving Andrew to watch from the sidelines. These weren't coincidences. They were deliberate signals of a shifting balance of power, and each one left Andrew's pride a little more bruised. William, on the other hand, saw Andrew through a very different lens. To him, Andrew wasn't a sidelined prince clinging to the past. He was a liability. In William's eyes, Andrew's controversies had already done enough damage to the monarchy's reputation. Bringing him closer was not an option. Keeping him at a distance was a necessity. The cold professionalism with which William dealt with his uncle only deepened the divide. Where Andrew expected respect rooted in tradition, William offered calculated distance rooted in strategy. Andrew's frustration turned inward, festering into something darker. He began to view every royal event as a stage where he was being quietly humiliated. His once commanding presence was reduced to polite nods and minimal mentions. And as he watched William gather influence, form strategic alliances, and shape the monarchy's future, his sense of exclusion became unbearable. This unspoken war was fought not with shouting matches or public confrontations, but with subtle gestures, unreturned calls, and deliberate omissions. It was a royal Cold War, silent, strategic, and growing more intense with each passing month. Andrew's bruised ego and longing for the past made him susceptible, vulnerable to anyone who could promise him a way back into relevance. But the rivalry remained manageable until Camilla entered the equation with a proposal that Andrew simply couldn't refuse. Camilla has always known that power in the palace isn't taken. It's built through quiet influence. As the Queen's health waned, she began crafting her own alliances, threading loyalty where Charles's authority couldn't reach. And in Andrew, she saw more than a disgraced prince. She saw an opportunity. A private dinner, a carefully chosen wine, a whispered promise. This was the night the secret pact was born. For years, Camilla had observed the internal machinery of the monarchy with sharp precision. She understood its rhythms, its fractures, and most importantly, the vulnerabilities that could be turned into leverage. Unlike Charles, who relied on traditional structures of command, Camilla preferred to operate in the shadows, shaping outcomes through influence rather than direct confrontation. She knew that William's rising power would eventually overshadow her role, no matter her title. The future king was young, decisive, and increasingly surrounded by loyal figures who didn't see Camilla as a central force in the monarchy's next chapter. That reality unsettled her. And in the months following the Queen's decline, William began taking on more responsibilities, streamlining royal operations, and making decisions that reflected his vision rather than his father's. Camilla noticed how courtiers who once hesitated to act without consulting Charles were now turning to William. His authority was no longer approaching when it had arrived, and that shift presented Camilla with a choice: either accept her gradual fading into ceremonial relevance or build a network strong enough to counterbalance William's growing dominance. She turned her attention to Andrew. For most, he was a liability tainted by scandal and stripped of influence. But Camilla saw something others overlooked: Andrew's deep connections with the old guard. Many within the palace's traditionalist circles still saw him as one of their own, someone who embodied the old ways they longed to preserve. His fall from grace had left a vacuum, and his bitterness made him malleable. If she could align herself with him, she could tap into a hidden current of influence still flowing through those who resisted William's modernization. The dinner was quiet, deliberately off the radar. This wasn't a meeting between two equals. It was a calculated move by a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. She offered Andrew something he craved more than anything else: a route back into relevance. Mutual protection. subtle support in palace matters, a promise that she would advocate for his gradual reintroduction into certain royal circles if he, in turn, backed her behind the scenes. She didn't need him to be public. She needed him to be useful. For Andrew, this was more than a strategy. It was survival. Being pushed aside by William had left him isolated, and Camilla's offer sounded like a lifeline. In that room, over quiet, words and measured tones, a new alliance formed. It wasn't documented, nor did it need to be. The power of the pact lay in its secrecy. Andrew pledged quiet loyalty. Camilla offered pathways. Both believed they had something to gain. But neither fully grasped the storm that would follow. Because in the palace, secrets have a way of crawling out of the dark. And while the pact was sealed in whispers, the palace is a place where secrets never sleep for long. It wasn't supposed to get out. But one careless comment, overheard in a dimly lit hallway, set off a chain reaction. Within hours, snippets of the Camilla-Andrew deal reached William's closest aides. And as the future king pieced together the betrayal, the quiet fury in his eyes sent chills through everyone in the room. He didn't yell. He planned. For weeks, the pact had existed in silence, known only to those who had a hand in its making. But the palace has always been a place where whispers slip through cracks, no matter how tightly doors are shut. It happened almost by accident. A late-night conversation between Andrew's assistant and Camilla's private secretary was meant to be discreet. But a passing aide, well-trained in the subtle art of listening, caught just enough to know something was wrong. A few phrases, a tone too conspiratorial for routine palace chatter, it was enough to ignite suspicion. At first, there was disbelief. William's aides were used to gossip swirling through the palace, most of it exaggerated or harmless. But this was different. The language they overheard wasn't idle talk. It hinted at strategy, promises, and an alliance that didn't belong in the shadows. The aide who heard it reported everything verbatim, and within hours, a quiet but urgent verification process began. Names were checked, conversations were cross-referenced. Slowly, a clear picture emerged. What had once sounded like rumor crystallized into something undeniable. Camilla and Andrew had struck a deal, behind William's back. The revelation reached William in a private briefing, deliberately scheduled away from prying eyes. One by one, his trusted team laid out the fragments they had collected of overheard phrases, subtle shifts in Andrew's behavior, and Camilla's unusual level of coordination with traditional palace figures. As each detail was presented, William listened without interruption. He didn't show shock. He didn't ask for time to think. He simply absorbed it all, his expression sharp, his silence heavy. Those present later described the moment not as an explosion, but as a freezing of the room. William's reaction was not emotional, it was strategic. He understood the weight of what had been uncovered. This wasn't just Andrew seeking relevance. This was a direct maneuver to undermine his future authority. Camilla had chosen her ally carefully, and Andrew had taken the bait willingly. William didn't respond with outrage. He responded with calculation. That was what made him dangerous. Almost immediately, he ordered quiet monitoring. Internal security began to track Andrew's movements, his calls, his meetings, but without alerting him. Discretion was paramount. William wanted information, not confrontation, not yet. Behind the scenes, subtle measures were put in place to ensure every step Andrew took within palace grounds was observed. And as the operation unfolded, William's mind was already crafting his next move. He knew this betrayal couldn't be confronted impulsively. It had to be dismantled carefully, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the alliance but silence. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was the beginning of a power reckoning. William wouldn't just confront Andrew, he'd dismantle him. And William's first strike wouldn't be public, it would be meticulously orchestrated from the inside. Behind an ornate door in Clarence House, 3 members of the royal family faced each other in a storm of time, quiet rage. William, Camilla, Andrew. No cameras, no courtiers, just raw power and betrayal hanging thick in the air. What unfolded in that room would redefine alliances forever. William had chosen the setting deliberately. Away from the grand halls and curious eyes, he wanted the conversation to unfold, where formality would not shield anyone. It wasn't a discussion. It was a reckoning. After gathering enough evidence to know exactly what had been planned behind his back, he summoned Andrew and Camilla privately, giving them no time to prepare elaborate defenses. They entered that room thinking they could explain. William entered, knowing he didn't need explanations, he needed clarity, and he would get it. Camilla was the first to speak, her tone controlled, her words chosen with precision. She tried to reframe the entire situation as a simple misunderstanding, a family conversation, a private agreement made in the interest of keeping the royal house united. She downplayed the seriousness of the pact, implying that it was merely about mutual support during a transitional period for the monarchy. But William was not swayed. He saw through every layer of her diplomatic phrasing. He knew this wasn't about unity. It was about power. Andrew, emboldened by Camilla's presence, shifted the narrative further. He accused William of sidelining him unfairly, of freezing him out without giving him a chance to reclaim his dignity. He argued that the monarchy had always been about tradition, and that his role had been eroded not by his actions, but by William's ambition. Beneath the words was bitterness that had been festering for years, the resentment of a man who once held privilege and couldn't accept how far he had fallen. William listened without interruption, but his silence was not a weakness. It was authority. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but sharp, cutting through their defenses like a blade. He made it clear that this wasn't a debate. He reminded them both that he was the heir to the future king, and that their actions were not just personal betrayals, but direct challenges to the stability of the crown. There was no room for confusion. His stance was unshakable, his tone deliberate, leaving no doubt about where power truly resided. Camilla attempted to test his resolve, weaving subtle manipulations into the conversation. She hinted at the importance of family unity, at the dangers of internal division becoming public, at the optics of a fractured royal house. But William didn't flinch. He knew that yielding in that moment would set a dangerous precedent. He was not there to negotiate with conspirators. He was there to assert control. Andrew, realizing the gravity of William's demeanor, faltered. His earlier defiance gave way to unease. For the first time, he understood that this wasn't a private disagreement to be swept under the rug. William wasn't just confronting them, he was making a decision. And when William finally rose to leave, he didn't shout, he didn't demand apologies, and he didn't offer compromises. He left the room in silence, but that silence carried more weight than any declaration could. The decision was already made. His next move would not be words, it would be action. And when William made his move, it wasn't just a punishment, it was a message to everyone watching. The royal household had not witnessed such a swift, cold act in decades. Overnight, orders were signed, courtiers were instructed, and Andrew's world began to collapse. A prince once accustomed to endless privileges awoke to find the palace doors closing literally. William's hand was unmistakable, and the message was brutal. Betrayal has consequences. William did not wait. The silence he carried out of Clarence House had not been indecision. It had been the calm before the strike. Once back in his office, he moved with precision. In a matter of hours, Andrew's access to key palace, residences and offices was formally revoked. Locks were changed, security clearances were quietly updated, and the spaces Andrew had taken for granted were suddenly out of reach. There were no warnings, no conversations, no opportunities for negotiation. The shift was absolute. Next came the stripping of ceremonial privileges. For years, even in exile, Andrew had clung to fragments of his royal status, small honors and responsibilities that, while symbolic, gave him the illusion of importance. William targeted those symbols directly. Every honorary role, every ceremonial entitlement, every vestige of institutional prestige Andrew still held was systematically removed. His private staff, once funded discreetly through palace channels, saw their support terminated without delay. There was no slow fade, just a hard, clean break that left Andrew staring at the ruins of his former standing. Even his security details were reassigned. For someone like Andrew, who had lived his entire life surrounded by layers of royal protection, this was more than logistical. It was psychological. The moment he stepped outside and saw unfamiliar faces guarding him, he understood something fundamental had changed. The network he had relied on for decades had been quietly replaced, its loyalties redirected to William. It was not just a demotion, it was a severing of power at its roots. What shocked the palace most was the speed. Courtiers who had grown accustomed to endless deliberations and bureaucratic delays were left reeling at how decisively William moved. His orders were clear, his timelines immediate, and his expectations unquestionable. This wasn't the slow, ceremonial monarchy of the past. This was the future king, asserting his authority with clinical force. The public announcement was carefully crafted, as always. It framed the decision as part of an organizational restructuring, a neutral phrase designed to avoid scandal while signaling a shift. But inside the palace, no one was fooled. The wording was a shield. The reality was punishment. For Andrew, the impact was devastating. He had believed that his pact with Camilla gave him leverage, that his royal blood would protect him from the consequences of quiet scheming. But as each privilege vanished, it became painfully clear that he had underestimated William's resolve. In a single night, the heir had done what years of public scandal had not fully achieved. He had rendered Andrew powerless. This was not just a disciplinary action. It was a statement. One the entire royal household understood. William had drawn a line, and Andrew had been pushed beyond it with ruthless efficiency. But the storm inside the palace was far from over, because Camilla wasn't ready to back down. Camilla has survived decades in the royal family by mastering the art of quiet retaliation. William's power play wasn't just a blow to Andrew, it was a direct challenge to her emerging authority. And she wouldn't let it pass unanswered. Within days, subtle whispers began reaching sympathetic courtiers, painting William as ruthless and impulsive. The queen consort was preparing her counter-offensive. For Camilla, the stripping of Andrew's privileges wasn't just an administrative decision. It was a calculated strike that undermined an ally she had carefully positioned within the palace's power structure. She understood better than anyone that in the monarchy, public perception and private alliances are inseparable. If William was allowed to act so decisively without resistance, it would cement his dominance over every internal dynamic, and that was something she couldn't allow. Her response wouldn't be loud or reckless. It would be quiet, methodical, and precise. The kind of retaliation that could unsettle without leaving fingerprints. She began with her most trusted courtiers, those who owed their positions to her subtle influence over the years. Carefully, through casual conversations and off-the-record remarks, she started reshaping the narrative surrounding William's decision. Stories began circulating within the palace corridors, suggesting that the heir had acted too hastily, that he had bypassed established protocols, that his judgment was clouded by personal resentment rather than strategic foresight. These whispers were designed to plant seeds of doubt, not about Andrew, but about William's leadership style. Simultaneously, she reached out to select journalists known for their sympathetic coverage. The stories they published were carefully worded, never directly attacking William, but questioning his methods and timing. Words like ruthless and impulsive appeared in opinion columns, framed as insider perspectives. The effect was subtle, but effective. William's decisive move against Andrew was no longer just seen as a disciplinary measure. It was being reinterpreted as a potential power grab by an ambitious heir eager to consolidate control before his time. Behind the scenes, Camilla also approached King Charles privately, framing the situation as a family dispute rather than a power conflict. She urged him to mediate, implying that William's actions were driving unnecessary wedges within the family. She appealed not as a strategist, but as a concerned matriarch, knowing that Charles often preferred unity over confrontation. Her words were carefully chosen, suggesting that perhaps William needed to be guided, not opposed outright, but subtly restrained. Meanwhile, Andrew found himself with no choice but to fully align with Camilla's camp. With his privileges stripped and his options dwindling, he became a willing instrument in her growing counter-strategy. Their alliance deepened, united not by trust, but by mutual necessity. Andrew needed her influence. She needed his connections within the palace's older, more traditional circles. Together, they represented a quiet, but potent, source of resistance. William's team was not oblivious. They saw the sudden shift in whispers, the carefully placed narratives, the unusual pressure coming from corners that had been silent before. It was clear this was no longer about Andrew's punishment. This was a power war, unfolding in the shadows, with Camilla positioning herself as the quiet challenger to William's authority. And that showdown would explode in a way no one in the monarchy could have anticipated. It began with a single headline. Within hours, it became the story dominating global news: Royal rift boils over. For the first time in years, the royal family's divisions weren't whispered. They were broadcast for the world to see. William's decision to strip Andrew collided head-on with Camilla's carefully built image, and the monarchy itself trembled under the weight of the fallout. What had started as quiet palace maneuvering erupted into a full-blown media firestorm. Someone, somewhere, had leaked just enough details to ignite the press. William's decisive actions against Andrew were no longer confined to the corridors of royal power. They were on the front pages, analyzed on television panels, and dissected in every corner of social media. Within hours, the narrative fractured into two camps. On one side stood those who saw William as a symbol of justice, an heir finally taking decisive action to uphold royal integrity. On the other were those who rallied behind Camilla's quiet countermoves, painting William's actions as an overreach, a ruthless display of authority that threatened the fragile unity of the monarchy. The palace's media machine scrambled to contain the blaze, but it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own. Speculation ran rampant. Who had leaked the information? Was William's decision pre-approved by the king, or was he acting independently? Was Camilla actively resisting him? Or was this a calculated power play, masked as family, loyalty? These questions didn't just stir public intrigue, they exposed cracks that had long been plastered over. At the center of the storm was King Charles. His silence, once a symbol of dignified neutrality, began to be interpreted as weakness. Commentators questioned whether the king had lost control of his family or whether he was simply choosing to let the next generation fight its own battles. Either way, his inaction allowed the rift between William and Camilla to dominate the public narrative unchecked. Each day, he remained silent. The perception of division grew sharper. Royal appearances became increasingly strained. Where once the family moved in coordinated harmony, now every joint engagement carried a sense of unease. Observers picked apart body language, timing, and even the seating arrangements, looking for signs of where loyalties truly lay. The monarchy, known for its controlled image, was suddenly at the mercy of speculation, and the world was watching like never before. William, rather than retreating under pressure, doubled down. He made calculated public appearances that projected authority and resolve. His speeches subtly reinforced the values of accountability and leadership, framing his decision against Andrew as part of a broader vision for the future of the crown. These moves positioned him not as a reactionary heir, but as a leader taking charge. To his supporters, it was inspiring. To Camilla's allies, it was a direct challenge. Meanwhile, Andrew stood isolated, stripped of privileges, publicly exposed, and privately sidelined. He became an unexpected figure of sympathy for some. The sight of a prince brought low, stirred, complicated feelings, particularly among those who still viewed him through the lens of tradition rather than scandal. Camilla's camp quietly encouraged this sentiment, knowing that public sympathy could become a useful tool in their struggle against William's growing dominance. The rift was no longer a matter of palace politics. It was a public spectacle, and one that threatened to reshape the monarchy's power structure before the world's eyes. But what no one expected was the final twist William had kept hidden all along. While the world debated his boldness, William was already 3 steps ahead. The stripping of Andrew's privileges wasn't the endgame. It was the opening move. Behind palace doors, he was quietly securing alliances, reshaping the royal household, and preparing a decisive maneuver that would permanently diminish Camilla's influence and ensure Andrew's pact would die in silence. What came next stunned even his closest advisors. William understood that power in the monarchy isn't just about titles, it's about structure. He knew that if he wanted to neutralize Camilla's influence for good, he had to do more than react. He had to rebuild the very mechanisms through which power flowed. With deliberate precision, he began restructuring key palace committees, targeting those quiet corners where Camilla's loyalists had nestled themselves over the years. These were the individuals who shaped narratives, controlled access, and subtly tilted decisions in her favor. One by one, they were either reassigned, retired early, or replaced with figures loyal to William's vision for the future. It wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. While internal changes were underway, William also turned his attention outward. Through carefully timed and strategic leaks, he shifted public sentiment back toward his side. Stories portraying him as the steadfast protector of the crown began to emerge, emphasizing his decisiveness and his commitment to preserving the monarchy's integrity. Commentators who had once questioned his ruthlessness began praising his foresight. The public, tired of royal scandals and fractures, responded positively to the image of a strong, forward-looking heir taking control. It wasn't just a PR move, it was a calculated reclamation of the narrative that Camilla had tried to twist in her favor. Meanwhile, Andrew found himself trapped. His attempts to retaliate were crippled by his own isolation. Stripped of privileges, removed from influence, and abandoned by many who had once quietly supported him, he had no meaningful channels left to mount a response. Camilla's backing could only go so far, especially as William's restructuring dismantled their shared network of sympathizers. Every time Andrew tried to push back, he was met with procedural walls, tightened rules, and subtle reminders that his position had fundamentally changed. Camilla, too, began to falter. Her counter-strategies, once so effective in palace politics, were suddenly met by a unified front of younger royals rallying behind William. What had once been fragmented loyalties now coalesced into a single, powerful bloc centered around the future king. Her attempts to sway Charles privately met diminishing returns as the king grew increasingly weary of the escalating drama. She had underestimated William's patience and his ability to play the long game. As weeks turned into months, the shift within the monarchy became unmistakable. Decision-making flowed through new channels, influence tilted toward new faces, and the palace hierarchy subtly but irrevocably bent toward William's authority. This wasn't a temporary power play, it was the quiet establishment of a new royal era. Those who had once whispered in the dark found their voices diminished. Those who aligned with William found themselves elevated. The pact that began in shadows ended under William's iron will. And as the palace settled into its new order, one truth became clear. In the monarchy, power belongs not to those who whisper in the dark, but to those who act in the light. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.